And now, the moment we've all been waiting for. Our special guest, Sean K Reynolds. Sean has been writing games for over 25 years, starting with the end days of TSR, rolling over into the Wizards of the Coast era, switching to video games for a while, then a long stay at Paizo, and now is a designer developer at Monte Cook Games. He's worked on Dungeons and Dragons, more than 5 different D&D settings, including Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk, Pathfinder, Alternity, World of Darkness, Numenera, Cypher System, and various card games, as well as GM and player tools such as the Consent in Gaming product that he wrote with Shauna Germain. His most notable works include the 3rd edition Forgotten Realms setting, the Pathfinder Beginner Box, and the Numenera Core Book, which won 10 Ennies in 2014, including 5 gold and 5 silver, including Product of the Year. And today, Sean will be talking about Forgotten Realms and the Better Magical Television Set. Forgotten Realms and the Better Magical Television Set, Sean Reynolds.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to your Toastmasters group. This is the first time I've ever been to one of these. The Magical Television Set is a phrase we developed while working on the Forgotten Realms campaign. We try to visualize this world as a real place where there are people who have lives, and the rules of Dungeons and Dragons that we use to present that world in a game format are essentially a television set that is allowing us to view that world and translate it into something that works on paper. Previous iterations of the D&D rules, from 1st edition to 2nd edition, or 2nd edition to 3rd edition, which happened in 1999, 2000, we, in particular for the 1st edition version of the rules, the transition from 1st to 2nd involved a catastrophic event called the Time of Troubles, where the gods were kicked out of their realms in the celestial planes, forced into mortal bodies, and were wandering the world of the Forgotten Realms. And there was chaos magic and all sorts of strange disruptions. It created a trilogy of novels that actually were incredibly well-selling novels, but it was a great disruption to the campaign setting in terms of people playing it as part of their D&D home game. When we were working on the transition from 2nd edition to 3rd edition, we decided we didn't want to blow up the world. We didn't want to make significant changes to the timeline, to kill off major adversaries, to do things that people in their home game would have to make significant adjustments for. For example, if you kill off a major villain in our story of transitioning to a new edition of the game rules, game masters who already had plans for that villain in their campaign suddenly have to do an end run around our canonical story, bring that character back from the dead, or otherwise do something that doesn't necessarily fit what the publishing company had done for the setting. And it was our goal to minimize any of those sort of disruptions. So what the new edition of the rules was allowing us to do is it allowed us to look at the Forgotten Realms with a new, improved, and clearer television set. So that something in the previous edition of the game, you might have a conflict between the Red Wizards of Thay and the witches of their adjacent country, Rashomon, and their continuing conflict and ongoing war and stealth war for many, many decades. With the new edition of the rules, we had things like wizards are a type of person who casts spells, and a sorcerer is a different kind of person who casts spells, and the mechanics of how their magic works in the game were significantly different. And one of the changes that we decided would fit for this was the Red Wizards of Thay, which is literally their title. They would remain wizards. The Witches of Rashomon would gain this radical, different sort of new magical spellcasting that was available in the new game rules called sorcery. And so that also set up a conflict in how these two groups viewed each other, because sorcerers have innate magic that they practice and improve at, just like an athlete who has natural talent. A wizard studies magic and learns lore, and so they have much more academic perspective. And both of them believe that theirs is the best way to do magic. And we already had this conflict in the setting that set these two groups up against each other. Now, with the new version of the rules, we also had backstory for the mechanics of how these two things work. Forgotten Realms is an old game setting. It was the creation of Ed Greenwood, who was a dungeon master, who ran his home campaign for many, many years. And then he started writing for Dragon Magazine, and his articles were about spells and magic items and dragons and interesting characters that he created for his home game. If you look at old issues of Dragon Magazine, you see Ed in these articles referring to, well, in the Forgotten Realms, my home campaign. And it was only after several years of him doing this that people realized there is a whole world of lore here that Ed Greenwood has created. We want to hear more about what Ed has to do. And so TSR approached Ed and bought the rights to publish his home game as a campaign setting, the Forgotten Realms. And he wrote most of the core materials for that initial release. He has been involved in most products to some extent in the intervening years. And when it came time for us to work on the 3rd edition version of the Forgotten Realms setting, we knew we had to get Ed involved. The 4 designers that we pulled together for working on 3rd edition FR were Ed himself, representing all the original Realms lore and the canonical, this is how I meant it to be in my campaign. Skip Williams, who also has a long legacy of working for Dungeons and Dragons. He was in Gary Gygax's original D&D campaign. He answered rules questions in Dragon Magazine as part of Sage Advice. Skip Williams is the Sage. The 3rd designer was me, who was the young, scrappy upstart who had been at the company for 2 or 3 years and had gotten his, teeth firmly lodged into various campaign books and was ready to take my knowledge of the 3rd edition rule set and apply those to the new Forgotten Realms. And the 4th was just a complete wild card. His name is Rob Hainso. He later went on to write a game called 13th Age with Jonathan Tweet, who was another D&D designer. And he had just an entirely different perspective on where we wanted to come from and go with the Forgotten Realms. When we were working on the 3rd edition Forgotten Realms setting, we had the entire Forgotten Realms team take a trip up to Toronto. Ed Greenwood lives in a tiny town outside of Toronto. We essentially had a summit to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, the new version of the rules, and how we could make those rules apply to the setting using the metaphor of our improved television set. Another example of things that we altered in the Forgotten Realms or improved with this new version of the game was magic item creation has always been kind of a hand-wavy aspect of the game. And it was very much a situation where if your character wants to learn how to make a particular magic item, whether that's making a magic sword or a potion or a magic cloak, there's not a lot of defined things on how to do that in the game system. It literally was half a page in the 2nd edition Dungeon Master's Guide. In 3rd edition, we codified these rules. So if you wanted to learn how to make scrolls, you take this ability, it costs you this much to make a scroll, you need these sorts of resources, and it takes you this much time. One of the aspects of the rules was that wizard characters, by default, had a very easy time learning how to make magic items. And harkening back to the Red Wizards of Thay, that meant that the Red Wizards of Thay had an entire political structure because their country is a magocracy. The leaders literally are wizards. They had the structure of apprentices and lesser mages who were working for the most powerful leaders of the group. And it's these minor characters, these minor wizards, who were churning out all of the cheap magic items that were available to their soldiers and their priests and other assassins and other characters who were subservient to the Red Wizards of Thay, but needed magical arsenal at their fingertips. We also realized that one of the dichotomies between wizards and sorcerers is that wizards' magic is based on intelligence, and sorcerer's magic is based on charisma, which is more of an internal, like, I have the force of will to draw upon the magic that is within me. The red wizards, being intelligence-based magic users, have very, very high intelligences. If you look at the game stats for these characters, they are all ranking at least at the genius level. And the most powerful ones are super genius, like they would dwarf the fantasy equivalent of Albert Einstein. With that in mind, we looked at the history of the setting and realized that the red wizards keep fighting their neighbors over and over again, and their tactics weren't working. And it didn't make sense for these super genius wizards to just keep wasting resources on these feudal attacks over and over and over again. And so one of the changes that we made was there was a sub-faction within the hierarchy of the red wizards who said, we need to stop just throwing resources at this war. There are other ways that we can win this fight. And capitalism turned out to be the answer. Because with these young, impressionable wizards who needed to be crafting magic items for the red wizards, they had essentially a team of specialists who they could send out to various major cities throughout the setting and create enclaves that are basically embassies for the red wizards of Thay. It was sovereign territory for the red wizards. Part of the agreements were that they would not be using their magic in a hostile way against the local government, and they would be producing magic items that could be sold for profit. And some of those would also go to the local country or capital city. So you could have the capital city of Cormyr, which is hundreds of miles away from Thay. They suddenly have a red wizard enclave. And everyone is going to be suspicious of them because the red wizards are evil. And there are going to be situations where if there's a murder that takes place in the town, or somebody goes missing, or some sort of weird magical curse happens, people are going to look at the red wizards of Thay as being responsible. What having these enclaves did was not only did it give us an excuse to have a lot of easy, cheap magic items flowing out into the adventurer economy, it made the red wizards, who live 1,000 miles away from most parts of the campaign setting, it made them a local problem. We did world building to allow more GMs to bring in these interesting and powerful adversaries to be threats and foes, and perhaps even colleagues, depending on how neutral versus good and evil you wanted your campaign to be, for the adventuring PCs. Some of the things that we changed in the Forgotten Realms were a little more radical than that. And we did get a bit of pushback from people who were used to how the campaign setting had always been. And the way I see this sort of translation is the same concept of Disney or Marvel looking at their comic book properties and saying, we have 10, 20, 30 years worth of stories about these various characters. Which of those stories do we want to take and adapt to a television series or a Netflix series or a movie? And a lot of those evaluations are about removing aspects of the canon that we don't want to talk about and focusing on new aspects. And the people who make those decisions have to be very well versed in all the lore that is happening in the setting. And they need to know how all of those characters interact with each other. And you also have to know what things aren't really important. For example, Captain America in the Marvel Comics is an artist. And there was a time during the comics run where he literally was the illustrator for the Captain America comic book in the Marvel universe. So if Peter Parker went to the corner shop and bought a Captain America comic book, and he opened it up and looked at the credits, Steve Rogers would be listed there because nobody knew that Steve Rogers was Captain America. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that is not an issue. Steve Rogers does have the ability to illustrate. You see him illustrating himself as a monkey on a little bicycle in the Captain America First Adventure movie. But the aspect of him being involved in the comic books is not something that happens in the MCU at all. So that's the sort of thing that you need to disregard when adapting, a comic to a movie or adapting a game setting to a new version of the rules. And so some of the things we changed were, we greatly changed the map. There are a lot of sections on the Forgotten Realms map that were created organically over time, a lot of it by people who didn't do a lot of due diligence in researching their history of the setting, and created strange areas, sometimes very large areas. There's an area called the Shar on the Forgotten Realms map, which is this huge open grassland. So there's a lot of tribal people, some lion centaur people called Wemmicks, and it is a huge, huge area. Rich Baker, who was the creative director of the Forgotten Realms at the time, went literally to our Forgotten Realms map with an X-Acto knife and started slicing it and finding ways that he could consolidate parts of the map to get rid of these extraneous spaces. And he ended up removing a piece of the Shar from the final map so that it would fit better in what our goal was. This piece of the Shar that he removed was the size of California. But if you looked at the map, you wouldn't know, because it went from being a ridiculously huge area to just a huge area. Still usable as the Shar, still usable as an area where you can have all these tribal adventures, still part of the Forgotten Realms, but this aspect that didn't really need to be there. Another thing that we changed was, over the years, different designers wrote different books that were based in different parts of the world, and kind of arbitrarily decided the population numbers for certain things. So Kalimshan, oh, the largest city in Kalimshan has 1 million people in it. Oh, it's the largest city in the Forgotten Realms. Oh, but there's this other city in this other part of the world that is supposedly the largest city, but it only has 50,000 people. 1 million people, 50,000 people. An entirely different city might have 200,000 people. So one thing that we did was we looked at all the population numbers all over and said, all right, this is a big city, this is a small city, these are tiny cities, and we adjusted all that population. Working on the Forgotten Realms was an amazing opportunity for a person who loves doing creative work like I do. We had a great team. Everybody was able to participate in that summit and just throw out some really great ideas. And that book won a lot of awards. 20 years later, I am still incredibly proud of it and my work on the Forgotten Realms. And when I did a brief stint as a contractor for Wizards of the Coast a few years ago, I was immediately brought in to start working on Forgotten Realms stuff. There are different televisions that are being created over the years of the Forgotten Realms, but we're always kind of like fine tuning and trying to get rid of our little bits of static or interference from other electronic devices. Thank you.